everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about some different sources of bias that can skew your results when you do a statistical study. So take 3 deep breaths and let's make this math easy. Okay, so in statistics, one of the most common types of biases that will show up is a sampling bias. So a sampling bias happens whenever the sample is not actually representative of the entire population. And there's several different ways that can happen, but anytime that the sample does not fairly represent the entire population, you're going to have some type of bias that may influence the results of your study. So an example of this is voluntary response bias. So we talked about how voluntary response sampling is one of the less preferred methods of sampling. And the reason for that is because when a sample volunteers themselves, it's automatically excluding those people who are maybe too busy to answer the survey, or the people who are too grumpy to answer the survey, or whatever it is. But those people are still part of your population as a whole. And so if you're only surveying the people who volunteer to answer your survey, then you're going to have some bias because you're excluding other parts of the population. So for example, let's say that you set up a survey station on some popular walkway on campus, and then whoever stops to answer the survey, you ask them about how many hours per week they spend doing social activities. Well, if you're only asking the people who choose to stop and answer the survey, you're probably going to get pretty biased results, because if they want to stop and talk to you and take your survey, they're probably naturally more of a social person. And so they're probably going to spend more hours per week doing social activities than the people who just walk by and decide to not answer the survey. Now, obviously, that's not true across the board, but this would be an example of where your results may be biased because of the voluntary response sampling method. Another type of bias that can occur is when the researchers have an interest in the outcome. So an example of this is there is a recent study done by the Wrigley Science Institute that found that chewing gum may raise math grades in teenagers. But if you think about who's doing the research here, Wrigley is one of the biggest gum companies in the world. And so that's very convenient that they found a result that says that chewing gum may raise math grades in teenagers. And so this would be an example of the bias that can come when a self-interest study is being done. And it doesn't mean that you can't ever do a study that isn't self-interested. It just means that you need to be a critical thinker. And if you see a study that's clearly a self-interest study, then you want to be a little bit skeptical of the results until those results are proven in a different study. And then another type of bias that can show up is response bias. So response bias happens whenever the responder gives an inaccurate response for any reason. So for example, if you ask people when was the last time you visited your doctor, a lot of people will not be able to remember when the last time they visited their doctor was. And if they do remember it, it's going to be an estimate and it's not going to be a precise answer. And so their responses are going to be inaccurate. And that is an example of response bias. And another type of bias that can show up is perceived lack of anonymity. And this happens when the responder fears giving an honest answer might negatively affect them. So for example, if an employer sends out a job satisfaction survey, but you have to type in your email address to be able to access the survey, this might be an example of perceived lack of anonymity, because if you say, I'm not very happy with my job, then your boss might retaliate, or it might affect your relationship in the office or whatever. And so this would be an example of lack of anonymity. And this can still happen even if you have an anonymous survey. Because let's say that you have an employer that sends out the job satisfaction survey and it's an anonymous one. Well, if you only have like 3 people in your department and you know the other 2 people are satisfied and everybody kind of knows that you're still not anonymous, or at least you don't feel like you're anonymous. And so it would have the same impact even if you're not typing in your email address. Another type of bias that can happen is a loaded question. And this is when the wording of the question or even the tone of the question influences the responses. So, for example, if you ask people, do you support funding the research of alternative energy sources to reduce our reliance on high polluting fossil fuels? Well, the wording of this question is kind of leading people towards the answer yes, because you would have to have a pretty strong opinion to say, no, I think that we should keep on having high polluting fossil fuels. I think that's a great idea. Like, you would have to have some pretty strong opinions in the opposite direction to not answer yes to this question. So this would be an example of a loaded question. And then the last type of bias we're going to look at is non-response bias. So non-response bias is when people refuse to participate in the study, and that influences the validity of the outcome. So you'll always have some people who won't participate in the study, but if you have a lot of people who won't, or if the people who are choosing not to participate in the study are all from the same part of the population, so that part of the population is not being represented, then that's when you get non-response bias. So an example of this would be if you were doing a telephone poll and you called people and asked them the question, do you often have time to relax and read a book? And if 50% of the people that you called refused to answer the survey, this would be an example of non-response bias, because if half of the people that you're calling won't even answer your survey, then the people who are responding are not going to really represent the entire population as a whole. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I hope that you guys have a good day.